Today we're going to be talking about understanding exposure. I was thinking the other day about learning photography and I was reminded of the things that gave me the most frustration back in the day. And honestly, there were quite a few aspects of photography that I struggled with. But if I were to rank the things that gave me the most amount of trouble, at the top of the list would be undoubtedly be understanding exposure. I'm guessing since you're here watching this video, you're in the same boat as well. It's easy to be confused with exposure because it's a complex topic. And quite honestly, watching one video about exposure isn't going to be the end all or be all either. Like anything else in photography, mastering exposure will require time, practice, and patience. However, what you will have by the end of this video is a basic understanding of what exposure is, what the different components of exposure are, and how it all comes together to influence how your photos look. That being said, let's get started understanding exposure. First things first, what the heck is exposure anyway? To put it simply, exposure refers to how bright or how dark an image is. An image that is too bright is referred to as being overexposed. Conversely, an image that is too dark is referred to as being underexposed. We can see these concepts in the following two images. In this first image, you see a wintry scene with two people riding horses. Notice how the sky is completely devoid of any detail. It's just a white blob. That's because the sky is overexposed. It's just too bright and has lost all the detail. In another wintry photo, you can see that it's too far dark. Notice how the snow looks dark, drab and gray? That's because this photo is underexposed. There are other problems with these photos too, but that's for another video and another day. So having seen examples of exposure, let's move on and discuss the different elements that allow you to control exposure. There are three elements of exposure which you can see in the chart on the screen: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The easiest way to think of the elements of exposure is in a triangle shape, seen here as the exposure triangle. Though each of these three elements can be used to manipulate light in a different manner, as the chart shows, they work together to influence exposure. In other words, it's the intersection of the ideal aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that really gets you the ideal exposure. So let's break each of these elements down and discuss what they do. Aperture refers to the size of the lens opening. As you can see in the image on the screen, the size of the lens and aperture can range from quite small to quite large. The larger the aperture opening, the more light that is allowed into the lens. The smaller the opening, the less light that enters the lens. In other words, the aperture controls the amount of light. Aperture is measured in f-stops, like f4, f11, and f16, though not all stops are nice even numbers. For example, as you can see in the graphic, you can shoot with an aperture of f1.4, f2.8, f5.6, and so forth. This can make it confusing to understand the aperture scale. Further complicating matters, it's the larger the f number, the smaller the aperture size. Again, if we look at the chart on the screen, you can see how f1.4 is a very large aperture and lets in lots of light, while f32 is a very small aperture and lets in very little light. So let's say you have an overexposed image. How would you use aperture to get a better exposure? Well, all else being equal, you would just use a smaller aperture to darken the photo. For example, if the image was taken at f2.8, for example, try shooting at f4 to limit the amount of light to darken it. The second element of exposure is shutter speed. Shutter speed controls how long the camera shutter is open. The longer the time the shutter is open, the more light that passes through to the camera sensor. Conversely, the shorter the time the shutter is open, the less light that passes through. Because of this, shutter speed controls the duration of light. Fortunately, it's easy to understand how shutter speed is measured. Like aperture, shutter speed denotes in stops. However, shutter speed is measured in seconds, in fractions of seconds, as shown here. Though the scale only shows shutter speed of 1 second up to 1/8,000th of a second, with the right gear, you can extend the shutter to minutes and even hours in length. Each time you change the shutter speed by one stop, you double or half the duration of light. So let's assume again that we have a photo that's overexposed. All else being equal, changing the shutter speed from 1/500th of a second to 1/250th of a second would darken the image because we're cutting the duration of light in half. The final component of exposure is ISO. ISO controls the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. The lower the ISO value, the less sensitive the camera is to light. On the other hand, the higher the ISO value, the more sensitive the sensor will be. ISO is measured in stops just like aperture and shutter speed, but again, the ISO value are easier to understand than aperture. That's because ISO is measured in whole numbers like 50, 100, 200, 400, and so forth, as you can see here in the chart on the screen. With each change in ISO value, you either double or half the sensitivity of light. Using our same example of overexpose, if the image was taken at ISO 400 and is too bright, changing ISO to 200 would make the image darker, all else being equal. If things are confusing at this point, perhaps a metaphor about exposure will help figure things out. Let's pretend that your camera is the brains of the operation and the lens is the camera's eyes. Just like your eyes allow you to see, the camera's lens serves the same function. And just like your brain records what your eyes see, so does the camera when you take a photo. In this situation, think of your eyelids as the aperture of the lens. The wider you open your eyes, the more light that allows to enter, right? That means having your eyes wide open would be like using a big aperture to take a photo, like f1.4 for example. On the other hand, if you squint and your eyelids are virtually closed, the amount of light is restricted, just like using a small aperture when you're taking a photo like f22. Continuing with the metaphor, blinking is a good way to think of shutter speed. The more you blink, the more the duration of light entering your eyes is restricted. So if you blink a lot, it's like using a fast shutter speed on your camera, like 1/1000th of a second. Conversely, making the period of the time between blinks longer, you let in more light into your eye. For example, if you hold your eyes open for 5 seconds, that would be like 5 seconds shutter speed of light entering the situation. Lastly, think of sunglasses as ISO control for your eyes. By putting on sunglasses on a sunny day, you make your eyes less sensitive to light, just like using a lower ISO does on your camera, perhaps like ISO 100. However, if you take off your sunglasses, your eyes become much more sensitive to the light, just like when you're using a higher ISO like 1600 or so. So to review, exposure is controlled by aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Manipulating one of the elements can make the exposure brighter or darker, but often manipulating 2 or all or 3 of these elements is necessary to get a well-exposed image. We need to keep in mind that changing these settings impact more than the brightness or darkness of the image as well. As you can see in this chart, each of the exposure elements also impacts how your photo looks from an artistic standpoint. For example, shutter speed controls the duration of light as well as the amount of motion blur in a photo. The longer the shutter speed is open, the more blur that will occur, as you can see in this image. Conversely, the shorter the shutter speed, the more likely you are to freeze the movement in your subject, as you can see here. Aperture, on the other hand, not only controls the quantity of light, but it also is one of the components that controls the depth of field or the area that is in focus. Using a small aperture like f22 generates a very deep depth of field, as you can see in the landscape photos like this one. But using a large aperture like f1.4 generates a shallow depth of field with a blurry background, as you can see in many portraits as here. Lastly, ISO controls both the sensitivity of the camera sensor to the light as well as the presence of digital noise. Digital noise looks like film grain and is often used to add grit to photos, particularly in black and white images. So now that you have a working understanding of exposure, the exposure triangle, and the artistic effects you can create by manipulating exposure settings, all that is left now is to go practice. By utilizing the knowledge you've gained from this video, you'll be far better equipped to tackle exposure and start taking improved photos. So now, go grab your gear, head outside, and start taking control of your exposure. Look, it's been fun putting this video here together for you. Be sure to subscribe, like it, hit the bell to be notified when we come out with something new, and my friend, we'll see you next time.